Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be back at my alma mater. My 4 years at Durham were definitely one of the highlights of my life. When I was asked to give this presentation very kindly by Professor Ihtishami to talk about Iraq's foreign relations between the West and the East, it reminded me of a quote from the late Sir Winston Churchill, in which he categorized British foreign policy in three circles. So for the sake of simplification and because it made sense, I thought Iraqi foreign policy could be sort of described in three major circles. On the one hand, you have international institutions in which Iraq has been constantly and historically very active, with organizations like OPEC, the Arab League, the United Nations, and the Non-Aligned Movement. And then you have Iraq's interactions with the Eastern Hemisphere, with Iraq's neighbors, regional Arab states, the Russian Federation, and East and South Asian states, which I will focus on today for the purpose of this conference. And finally, the third hemisphere would be the Western Hemisphere. For obvious reasons, the United States come in at the very top, followed by the European Union, Canada, and I've also included Australia and New Zealand because they're English-speaking first world countries. Iraq historically has constantly transitioned or shifted or switched between two major schools of foreign policy. On the one hand, you've had the pan-Arab school, which has advocated an aggressive pan-Arab Iraqi foreign policy, supportive of Arab liberation movements and Arab regimes, as part of a larger Arab nation with Iraq in the lead. And then you've had the more prudent and pragmatic Iraqi school, which pledged cooperation to other Arab regimes. However, it was more respective of Iraqi identity and independence. For any country, foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. So to have a healthy foreign policy, you need a healthy domestic policy. And there have been various issues that have affected Iraqi foreign policy, greatly damaging its impact on the international stage. Number one being the lack of stability on the domestic arena, ideology, and lack of improvements in the political situation. Iraqi foreign policy has predominantly been restricted by two major issues. First of all, for example, its deficient sovereignty. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2014, large areas of Western Iraq are controlled by tribal groups, and large areas of Western Iraq are controlled by radical Islamist groups, for example, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which is a hugely powerful organization in Western Iraq. And then on the other hand, you've had domestic instability, which has also had a negative impact on Iraqi foreign policy, consequence of Iraq's geopolitical location, surrounded almost a landlocked country, surrounded from six sides by relatively hostile states. And obviously, you also have the population structure, which is part of domestic instability, Iraq being a composition of various ethnic and sectarian groups, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Kurds, the Chaldean Christians, the Turkmens, etc. Iraq has also suffered from the unfulfilled leadership role, having the ingredients of national power and influence, but at the same time diluted due to domestic and intrinsic circumstances. A fascinating thing about Iraq, which applies today in 2014, and it applies in 1921 when it was established by the British as a British mandate, and in 1932 when the British mandate ended, is that Iraqi identity is secondary to other considerations. And as you can see, this very important quote, in a secret memo from King Faisal, in which he wrote to his close circle of advisors, telling them with great sadness how there were no Iraqi people living in Iraq. And that applies today as it did 82 years ago. So to understand Iraqi foreign policy, it is quite important to highlight four major issues. I'll try and go through them quickly just to give you an idea. Iraq being a dual state, Iraq and the Kurdish issue, Iraq's Sunni-Shiite divide, and Iraq's lack of security and foreign policy. So what do we mean by Iraq being a dual state? Iraq is a fascinating example of a dual state. On the one side, you have a public state with a nominal constitution, parliamentary institutions, governmental institutions, and an army. But the real state and the real power lies within the shadow state. And this is where most of the political arrangements and agreements are made, which are based on networks of trust, networks of community, based on associations of patronage, privilege, nepotism, and cronyism, and other sources of corruption. As for Iraq and the Kurdish issue, effectively, the Kurdistan region is a state within a state. It enjoys its separate economy. Its internal boundaries with Arab Iraq are hugely disputed, and it pursues a separate foreign policy. And the status of its security forces, i.e. the Peshmerga, are disputed by the central government in Baghdad. Ladies and gentlemen, this image is quite interesting. The image you see here are trenches in Kurdistan. On the opposite side, you have trenches of the government in Baghdad. So that's how tense the situation is between Kurdistan and Baghdad. And then you have Iraq's Shiite-Sunni divide, also a hugely detrimental issue to Iraq's foreign policy. The Shiites traditionally feel that they are entitled to run the country. The Sunnis also feel that they have the same entitlement. The Shiites feel that they have been long-time victims. The Sunnis have historically run the country and feel that it's something that they deserve to do. The Shiites are the population majority in Iraq. As for the Sunnis, their domination over various decades has impeded the development of a single national identity. As for Iraq's security, or lack of security, as I mentioned earlier, Iraq is a geographically flawed country, almost landlocked, with vast borders, very difficult to control and defend, and you have hostile neighbours interfering almost in most of the daily affairs of this country. And because of the vast borders, and because it's very difficult to control, and because you have a weak army, foreign fighters constantly go back and forth between Iraq and other regional countries. I mean, for example, in late 2011, the chief of staff of the Iraqi army, when the Americans withdrew, that was, explained and stressed that the Iraqi army would not be ready to defend Iraq until 2020. So obviously, these issues are both a symptom and a consequence of the points mentioned earlier, and obviously impacting greatly Iraq's foreign policy. One of the major circles I mentioned earlier on in the slide was Iraq's interactions with the West. And obviously, and for obvious reasons, as you kindly know, the United States would be a hugely important country to Iraq. To better understand Iraq's interactions with the United States, the hegemonic stability theory best explains this, because hegemons are on a constant quest to maximize their power via alliances, since relative gains are of significant value in the international system. And the hegemon like Iraq recognizes a smaller state like Iraq as a source of influence in the international system. And the converse would also apply. For a smaller state like Iraq, it would want to benefit from the provisions of the hegemon. Most recently, when Maliki visited Washington in November 2013, he asked for intelligence support and military hardware, all based on the strategic framework agreement that was signed in late 2008, but only made operational after the American withdrawal in December 2011. However, having said that, American influence has greatly diminished after their withdrawal. Iran seems to have filled the vacuum in Baghdad. As for the second circle I mentioned earlier, for the sake of simplification, was Iraq's active participation in international institutions. Iraq traditionally has pursued the middle power approach, which asserts flexibility and advantages in the international system. Iraq traditionally has been recognized and identified as a middle power, which means when allied with other states pursuing similar interests, it can be considered a system affecting state, which would be different to the nature of its interactions if allied to a superpower like the United States. So for that reason, multilateral coalitions are of huge importance to a middle power like Iraq, because they are able, when allied with states of comparable size and power, are able to influence the international system and pursue their interests to a certain extent. And Iraq has for many decades been quite active in terms of interaction, its involvement as a founding member or as an active member in various international institutions. For the purpose of this conference, and obviously because it's based on Pan-Asian relations with the Middle East, I found it very important to focus on China as an example of Iraq's interactions with the Eastern Hemisphere. As you all know, ladies and gentlemen, China is the world's second largest consumer of energy. China is the world's second largest economy. It produces around 4.19 million barrels of oil per day, which accounts for 4.7% of the world's production. It has been predicted, however, that for 2014, China will be consuming around 11.1 million barrels per day. Giving China a competitive edge in terms of its international interactions is that it pursues pragmatism. It pursues pragmatism and deals with unsavory regimes to meet its energy demands. China also, as Professor Ihtisham yesterday mentioned, provides other services to underdeveloped and developing countries, like building roads, railways, etc. And another thing that gives China the competitive edge is that the oil companies are state-owned, which means it's more about securing energy supplies and not so much about profit. So for us to understand China's policy towards Iraq and Iraq's policy towards China, it is very important to highlight China's policy towards the Middle East, because China's policy towards Iraq is part of China's policy towards the Middle East, which is restricted to three major points. If a policy is a vision, a view, a goal, China's policy towards the Middle East is firstly based on ensuring a continuous supply of energy from the Arab region. Secondly, ensuring the continuity of the Middle East as a major consumer export market, and also ensuring the security of energy supply lines. Ladies and gentlemen, for the Chinese Communist Party, economic growth and prosperity of the Chinese people is not just a matter of luxury, but rather a matter of the continuation of legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party rule. So what has China done? So if a policy is a vision, a view, a goal, what has China's strategy been? What has it done to achieve these goals? In terms of its strategy, as also mentioned yesterday by several of our colleagues, it has embarked on building a new Silk Road, or dubbed by some people as the Iron Silk Road, which is a network of pipes, roads and railways, as you can see in that image, coming over from the China region towards the Middle East region. And it has also changed its defensive posture from coastal defense to far seas defense, because this also asserts and confirms that China is quite worried about the security of energy supply lines. China, in terms of its relations with the Middle East, has tried to maintain good relations with all Middle Eastern states. It has tried to refrain from involvement in Middle Eastern disputes, as mentioned by several of our colleagues yesterday, and it has no intention or capability to challenge the role of the United States in the Middle East, and it even coordinates with the US on some issues to keep Sino-US relations stable. For the purpose of this conference, I managed to speak to the Iraqi embassy in Beijing several times in order to get up-to-date information on Iraqi policy towards China and Chinese policy towards Iraq. As for Iraq's policy towards China, the Iraqi embassy in Beijing told me that Iraq is quite determined and keen to gain China's support as a permanent member of the Security Council, especially so after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. Iraq is quite determined on gaining China's favorable influence on its regional allies in the East Asian region. The Iraqi government is quite determined on the participation of China in the rebuilding of Iraq. It wants China's active participation. And the Iraqi embassy also stressed to me several times that Iraq does not want to appear as a puppet of the West, especially of the United States. For that reason, it is quite determined on gaining very good relations with China, and it wants to maintain a balance between the West and the East. And for that reason, improved relations with China is a huge priority. The Iraqi government also supports one China policy. As for the other way around, China's policy towards Iraq. China obviously wants oil from Iraq. China purchases sulfur from Iraq on a non-governmental basis. And China wants Iraq to be a consumer market for its goods. The Iraqi embassy in Beijing also stressed to me that the Chinese government wants investment opportunities in Iraq, but because of legal restrictions by the Iraqi government, they're not able to actively do that. So the Chinese government has asked to substitute contract opportunities for investment opportunities, but that hasn't been done, but the Iraqi government is trying to do so. So let's talk about current Sino-Iraq relations. Trade exchange between China and Iraq for 2013 reached $22.18 billion US dollars, which means that China is Iraq's #1 and top trading partner. Imports from China by the Iraqi government was worth $6.11 billion US dollars. Two major oil companies, the CNPC and the CNOOC, are actively working in southern Iraq, i.e. in Arab Iraq, through oil service contracts. However, the largest Chinese oil company, Sinopec, is exclusively working in Kurdistan and has been blacklisted by the government in Baghdad. So for that reason, they're not able to work in the rest of Iraq, but they've placed their bets on Kurdistan, which means they feel there is a potential there. And however, the contract with Sinopec is based on a profit-sharing contract, which is more lucrative than the oil service contracts awarded by the Baghdad government to the Chinese companies in Arab Iraq. China is also quite active in terms of telecommunications. For example, Huawei and ZTE are quite active in Iraq. China has been awarded contracts to deal with Iraq's sanitation and water treatment. Iraq is the largest consumer and importer of Chinese electrical appliances in the Middle East, which is hugely important. There's a small cultural exchange, around 150 postgraduate students, and around 3,000 to 5,000 Iraqi resident businessmen with students and their families, and around 3,000 non-resident Iraqi businessmen. The relations are evolving considerably. For example, in 2012, the Iraqi embassy in China only issued 4,000 visas to Chinese workers and businessmen. This number rose by 150%, reaching 10,000 visas issued to Chinese workers and businessmen. And this excludes visas issued by the Iraqi government in places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai. As for Sino-Iraq relations on the Chinese side, as explained earlier, trade exchange for 2013 was $22.18 billion US dollars, which means China is Iraq's top trading partner. Iraq is the fourth largest Arab trade partner of China. Iraq is the fifth largest supplier of oil to China. And imports from Iraq for 2013 reached $16.70 billion US dollars. As a gesture of goodwill, the Chinese government in 2007 cancelled $2.85 billion US dollars owed by the previous Ba'ath government to the Chinese government. This was cancelled after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and they also cancelled 80% of 8.4 billion US dollars that was owed to Chinese private companies. In December 2012, the Chinese embassy opened its consular and visa services. In 2013 alone, 24,000 visas were issued by the Chinese government to Iraqi businessmen, students, tourists, and people going to China for medical treatment. And thanks again for your patience and for your interest. I appreciate that. Thank you. أمر وكما مصايكي بيوندينا ودولتي كان بجداريم كل كونفرنسي ودولتي بيوندي روشالاتنا وراست روشالات وباشوري آسيا وقلاي برستان ديارة روش هالاتي آسيا بيجيكي هجار جرينجي هي لناحية أبوريو بسر بيوندينا ودولتي كان وبيوندي كاني روشالاتنا وراست روش حالات زور دەبێت جەختی لێوە بکرێ و باسی لێوە بکرێت. ئەمڕۆ بابەتێکم پێشکەش کرد لەسەر پەیوەندەکانی عێراق و تا سیاسەتی دەرەوەی عێراق لە نێوان ڕۆژهەڵات و ڕۆژئاوا، بەڵام جەختکردنەوەی سەرەکیم لەسەر پەیوەندەکانی عێراق و ڕۆژهەڵات بوو. باسم لە سیاسەتی دەرەوەی عێراق لە سێ بازنەیەکیان پەیوەندەکانی عێراق لەگەڵ ڕێکخراوە نێو دەوڵەتیەکانە، لەلایەکی ترۆ بازنەی دووهەم پەیوەندەکانی عێراق لەگەڵ وڵاتانی ڕۆژهەڵاتە و بە جەختکردنەوە لەسەر وڵاتی چین، و بازنەی سێم پەیوەندەکانی عێراق لەگەڵ ڕۆژئاوادا بە جەختکردنەوە لەسەر وڵاتە یەکگرتووەکانی ئەمریکا. چین پێگەیەکی هێجگار گرنگی هەیە لە پەیوەندی نێودەوڵەتیەکانە. بۆ نمونە لە 2013 یەکەم شەریکی بازرگانی عێراق بووە بە 22.8 بلیۆن دۆلار کە ئەمە جێی گرنگیە. عێراق چوارهەم شەریکی بازرگانی چینە بە پلەی چوارهەم لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاستە، و عێراق پێنجەم دابینکەری نەوتە بۆ وڵاتێکی توینووی وەکو چین بۆ سەرچاوەکانی وزە. لەبەرەوە پەیوەندەکانی عێراق و پەیوەندەکانی کوردستان لەگەڵ چینە شتێکە کە دەبێت بەڕاستی باسی لێوە بکرێ. یەکێ لەو نمونە ئاشکرانە ئەوەیە کە گەورەترین کۆمپانیای چینی ساینۆپێک ئێستا لە کێڵگەکانی کوردستان ئیژەکات و لەلایەن حکومەتی ناوەندیەوە خراوەتە لیستی ڕەشەوە. ئەمە خۆی بەڵگەیە لەسەر ئەوەی کە چین کوردستان بە پێگەیەکی گرنگەزانێت لە پەیوەندی نێودەوڵەتەکانە، بۆیە توانیوێتی ئەو کۆمپانیا گەورەی دەست لە باشووری عێراق هەڵگرێ و جەخت بکاتە سەر کوردستانی عێراق. زۆر سوپاس.